So you've now learned how to create static content with HTML. Maybe you've laid out a web page or two, used some tags to provide structure, but that black text on a scalding white background wasn't really the effect you were going for, so you want to see how we can style that content. In this video, we're going to introduce CSS, which is a language that we can use to tell the browser how to take our HTML page and manipulate features like color, position, and size so that we actually get websites that reflect the creativity that we have. We're going to look at the parts of a CSS rule, see a couple examples of common rules that come up again and again, and then discuss just a few advanced features of CSS that give us more expressive power when we write our rules. To start us off, I'm going to show a website that's sort of similar to the one we made at the end of the last video. Here we have a website written in HTML. The HTML tag encloses the whole thing. We've got a body, we've got some tags surrounding different parts of our content like titles and paragraphs. If I go and want to load this web page, I can do so exactly the way that I did in the last video. I'm going to give myself a static web server, download it, and then run that server. Once it is up and running on port 8080, just like last time, I can refresh in a browser and see all of that content that I wrote. Now that I've verified my website runs, I'm ready to start adding some styling to it. In order to add styling, we need a separate file that's going to represent all of our style rules. Just like how HTML is written in files ending in .html, our style rules will be written in a CSS file. So if I go and I add, let's say, a styles.css, this is going to be the place where I write all of the different rules that I want to affect my website. So it is important to note that CSS is declarative. It is a language where we don't necessarily put things in the order that we want them to appear. Instead, we're going to describe all the rules we want, and the browser, it's going to be its job to figure out which HTML tags those rules should be applied to based on our definitions. So we're just going to give it this giant shopping list, and it's going to pick and choose every time it renders a tag, well, which ones among this list actually affect this tag. Each one of our rules is going to have two parts. First, we're going to have a selector that describes what the rule should affect. So this part's going to say, oh, target this tag or this section specifically. And then inside some curly braces, we're going to have a declaration or even a bunch of these declarations that describe what specific changes should occur. To give you an example of this, I might say, back in my HTML page, I've got this section tag. I want that tag to have some custom styling. I can write section here in my CSS and put a pair of curly braces after it to say, I want to modify this type of tag. And then inside my curly braces, I put different declarations that are each delimited by a semicolon. For instance, I could say, I want to change the color of text. There is this color rule. So I put the word color, then a colon, and then whatever color I want. Maybe I want the text to appear blue. So now I've written a complete rule, but if I go and I refresh my page right now, I go back to my website and I click refresh, I'm not going to see that change yet. And that is because we actually need to tell our web page that this second separate file is associated with all of the content that we've written in HTML. The way that we do that is we go up into this head Remember, the head tag is an area for metadata and extra information for the browser. What I'm going to put here is one additional tag that we didn't discuss in the last video, and that is a link tag. A link tag says there's this other document that is somehow related to the one that you're in right now. We have to describe a relationship for this document with the rel attribute, and our relationship is going to be a style sheet. So we've got our style sheet link, and then just like with a normal anchor tag or with an image, we need to tell the browser where this other file lives. So I'm going to use an href attribute, and I'm going to say this styles.css that we wrote, that is the document that I want to attach to the HTML here. Once I've done that, this CSS file and this HTML file, they're now linked together. And if I return back to my browser and I refresh one more time, suddenly all of the text that was in that section is now colored blue. This is the basics of CSS. This is how CSS rules work. And this is already very powerful. Just targeting individual tags gives us the ability to manipulate individual pieces of our website. But a lot of the power of CSS comes from the subtlety of how these rules interact. If you noticed, CSS applies my rule not just to the tag itself. When I wrote this rule for section. It also applied not just to the tag specified in a selector, but also to every child of that selector. So in our example up here, I've got section. In my web page, inside of the section, there's a header, and inside of the section, there's a paragraph. And both of those also became blue because they were children of that section tag. This is a way that CSS sheets cascade. That's what CSS stands for, is cascading style sheets. And one important detail here is this means different rules can actually overlap. If two rules do overlap, CSS will always prefer the rule that's more specific. So this is actually a really complicated set of rules on what counts as more specific than what else. It comes down to the count of the number of, first the specificity of the tag, and then the count of number of class selectors and tag selectors. We're not going to get into all of that. That's a little bit more in depth than our introduction to CSS here. But if you want to see a quick example of this, we can see that by writing a second rule here in our CSS style sheet. So as an example, inside of our section tag, we had this paragraph. Maybe I decide, well, paragraphs, I actually want them to be the color green, and I want them to have a bunch of margin on the left-hand side, 100 pixels of margin. This second rule is applying to this text here. So there's now two rules that conflict. We have our paragraph rule saying, hey, this sentence should be green. And we've got our section rule saying this sentence should be blue. If we do this, we save both of our documents and then we return to our browser, what we're going to see is that when I refresh, the green rule wins out. The text gets styled green and it gets that margin from the paragraph tag. The reason that this happened is because in our HTML document, this P is directly wrapping the text, and the section is a more general, more broad category that includes many things. Because P is inside the section, it's actually more specific. I can even put more than one declaration in here, and it will just overlap on the parts that are more or less specific. You can see I applied this rule and this rule both in one declaration separated by semicolons. If I had applied some other rule to sections that didn't get applied to my paragraphs, that would still be in effect. It's just the parts that overlap that CSS has to resolve which one it wants to use. So the next thing I want to talk about is what else we can put in this selector region besides just a tag name. Tag names are great. They do give us a lot of flexibility, but tag names aren't the only thing that can be targeted with CSS. In addition, I can target attributes of tags as well. Specifically, there are two that I want to look at in this video. Every HTML tag has two attributes that allow for easy identification for styling and also for JavaScript, as we'll see in a future video. These two attributes are the ID attribute, which uniquely identifies just one single element of a web page. If something has an ID attribute, that ID is completely unique. There can only be one of it. Then there is the class attribute, which identifies not just one element, but a entire logical grouping of tags on the page. These are things that don't necessarily even have to have the same tag name, but are multiple elements that I want to style consistently for one reason or another. Examples of this are things like maybe I've got some table that I'm constructing and I want the first row of the table, each element in it, to be styled a certain way. Maybe I want the ability to pick whether paragraphs have one set of rules or another, and there's no easy pattern, so I just label the ones that I want one way or the other. When I've written these attributes on my elements, like let's say I go in here and on my web page I decide, well, my couple elements on here are going to be bordered elements. I want to put a border on the main title, and then because I'm feeling extra creative today, I decide, well, my first list item should also get a border, and this paragraph should also get a border. And then I say, oh, well, this first list item, it's also a first bullet. This is the unique first bullet element. There's only one of these on the whole web page. Only one can be first. So I give it this ID attribute here. Once I've done that, back on my styles page, I can now refer to both of these things. If I want to target an ID attribute, then I write that ID name, but then I prefix that name with a hashtag. So an example of this would be for first bullet, hashtag first bullet. This is a selector here that is not referring to a tag with the name first bullet. It is referring to specifically this one single first bullet on my web page. So I say maybe, oh, well, my first bullet, I'm going to put the font size of this bullet all the way up at 26 pixels. Now I have written a rule that doesn't apply to every of an element. It's not every single bullet that gets changed. It's just going to be this first guy here. If I want to target a CSS, or if I want to target a CSS class, the way that I do that is with a dot in front of a name. So I take my name and I put a dot right at the beginning. So an example of this, looking back at our web page, we had that bordered class. So I put dot bordered here. And then I say, oh, well, maybe every bordered element, it gets some padding. Margin is space outside the element. Padding is space inside the element. I'm saying, well, inside of it, give me this buffer of 5 pixels, and then give me a border, a 1 pixel solid black border. And that rule is going to apply to this header, to this bullet point, to this paragraph, even though they are three completely different types of things, because I've grouped them together by class. If I go back to my web page and then I refresh it, we see that list item is the only one affected by the ID rule, and my three elements that I gave a class, they all got that border rule, each of them doing it however it applies to that type of element. So now that we've seen the ID selectors and class selectors, the one last feature that I want to show you is Selector Combinators. So Selector Combinators let us chain two of our other selectors together with some relationship. The three that I'm going to show you in this video are, first, I can put a space between two selectors. I can say I've got S1 and then a space and then S2. This might be two tag names like section P. This might be two IDs like first paragraph, first line with hashtags in front. Could even be a combination of the two. But when I put a space between two selectors like this, I'm saying target every S2 that you find anywhere inside an S1. So look for an S1 and then look for an S2 in that S1. If I put a arrow between the two, like S1 arrow to S2, then I'm actually saying target every S2 that you find directly inside an S1. So the difference here is subtle but important. If I put the arrow, I'm saying there must be this tag, and then right inside of it, there is some other tag. So look for list items that are directly inside an unordered list. Look for paragraphs that are directly inside a section. But if there's multiple layers, like I've got a section, and then I've got an ordered list, and I've got a sub list that's an unordered list, if I use the arrow, that rule's not going to take effect. If I use the space, then it will. So the last combinator that I'm going to introduce is a plus. So if I put a plus between two selectors like S1 plus S2, then what I'm saying is target every S2 that you find next to an S1. This is the sibling selector, the adjacent sibling selector, technically. And it's saying, well, you've got a paragraph, and then right next to that paragraph, there's an image. Maybe this means that the paragraph's a caption for the image. So I want to style that differently than if there's just a paragraph somewhere else on the page. And as you can see, these are ways that we actually can chain multiple different simpler rules together to provide contextual changes to our website. As an example here, on my web page, I had the whole page title up top with objectives, and then I had this title that's inside my section. You know, maybe I'm writing a news article and I've got my banner on the top, and then I've got some subsections with content. Maybe I decide, well, when I've got a section and I've got an H1 directly inside of that section, then I want background color. The background color on this H1, I could use another color specifier, a word like I've used in the previous examples. I'm going to sneak in here. There are different ways to talk about color. We can use hue, saturation, lightness if you prefer. We can use RGB. The one I personally like is one called Occult. Occult color is a three-part definition where first I say a percentage of lightness, like I want it 80% light, and then a percentage of chroma or saturation. So I say I want maybe 100% saturated, and then a hue, which is a degree on the color wheel. Starting from red, how many degrees I want to go, maybe 240 degrees to get me to a cyanish color because cyan is most of the way around the circle. You can specify color like this, and the nice thing is your colors will tend to look nicely together if you pick things around the same lightness, if you pick hues that are contrasting complements. I've got a whole course on that I teach students, but here in our web development, we just want to see this rule in action. So I save both of my files, I come back over to my browser, and when I refresh, you can see now that background, it was applied contextually. When the H1 is inside the section, it gets the cyan background. When the H1 is just at the top of the page, that rule does not apply. So this is an overview of a lot of the basic features of CSS. We've covered how to write rules that target tags, a couple common definitions like color and margin and font size and borders. We've also seen how we can target things like IDs and class attributes, as well as combine these different tags together. So just like with HTML, there's actually a lot more going on here. We're just scratching the surface. If this is a topic that you are interested in, the MDN web docs do again provide excellent guides, not just for HTML, but also for CSS. They cover a lot of the basics that you've seen in this video, and just like with the HTML elements reference, there is actually a CSS reference page that we can go to that lists everything that's possible in CSS. Things like blurring images, things like applying animations. And you can go and click on any of these saying, I want to look at an animation. How would I do that in CSS? And you get an example of what that rule looks like. You can play with them. You can click on the different ones, see all the properties that do apply. There are some special rules like keyframes and media tags that use their own extensions of rule syntax, where you actually put a rule inside of a bigger meta rule block. But now that you know how rules are basically laid out, all of that follows very intuitively. So it's my hope that this video has given you an introduction to how we can style our web pages. In the next one, we'll finally be ready to start looking at JavaScript content. So I will catch you all then.